what I'm going to talk today about is Stanley tools, mainly from the aspect of the collection itself rather than my personal experience of working there, although I will touch on that. I worked initially as a market planner there. My background is as an economist, believe it or not, and I started working for Stanleys in the late 70s, doing all their market planning, and moved very quickly into pure marketing. Looked after various products, which we'll touch on. But one of the things, when I moved up to Sheffield to work for Stanleys, I thought, and that's the kind of derivation of the title of the talk, I really thought Stanley Tools was a Sheffield firm, which many of you may have done at one time. Probably I'll go into some of that. So I was quite surprised when I arrived to find that it's not actually a Sheffield firm at all. And I'll get into that in a bit of detail. I mean, I think it's true to say that we went out of our way to make it feel like we were a Sheffield firm. You know, when I came up, I know I went to Hillsborough a few times. There was a huge sign that said Sheffield, the home of Stanley Tools. And there was one at Bramall Lane as well, apparently, but my wife's an owl, so I wasn't allowed to go to Bramall Lane. You know, we went to great lengths to sort of make that association. You may remember, certainly I think most of this is not a sexist comment, but most of the men in the room will probably remember Match of the Day back in the 70s and the 80s. And the one thing you always saw was Stanley Tools behind the goal. There was always a sign for Stanley's behind the goal on nearly every televised match, which sounds like a hell of a job, and it was. The advertising department in those days had to work really hard to make sure that Stanley had a presence at every ground. It wasn't like today, where you could just go to the Premier League or the English Football League and do a deal. You had to pick off individual grounds or groups of grounds through advertising. So it was quite amazing to see them at every ground, black and white. And even when we moved into colour TV, they were still there. So that kind of reinforced the message of Stanley being from Sheffield. Local identity, we went to great lengths to say on the products that they were made in Sheffield, England. And they were. These were manufactured in Sheffield, well, from the 30s. But were they designed in Sheffield? That's the question with some of these. And we'll get into that in a bit of detail. But if you go through to the collection, and some of this is out on display, we've got some at the back as well, you will clearly see either made in England or made in Sheffield, quite prominently displayed on the product itself, which I think really helped to reinforce the message of you know, Stanley being a local and quality product that you could depend upon. We had a fairly major local presence. So Stanley had a factory on the hill just, where are we? Just up on Rutland Road, Woodside, with the offices there. A major plant at Ecclesfield. We were out at Hackenthorpe, later at Helleby. So many places in Sheffield, Stanley was a big concern. You know, we had fairly large manufacturing plants that were very obviously visible. But having said all of that, it's not an English firm. It's, I assume everyone realizes, but made in Britain? Well, yes, but made in New Britain, Connecticut. So that's where they were actually based, just south of Hartford. It's a town about 100 miles northeast of New York in the state of Connecticut, which is really where the Stanley family came from. And when I say the Stanley family, in that area of the world, there were lots of Stanleys. And we'll talk about a few of those as we get into this. That's the true kind of birthplace of the Stanley name and the brand and the whole concept. New Britain, Connecticut. It was known as the hardware capital of the world. And that's not because of, so much because at that point they weren't making tools particularly, but they were making things like hinges and bolts and locks and just bits of metal for various uses, was all being made in and around the area of New Britain. Why that happened, no one's quite sure. It's one of those historical accidents that things came together and you ended up with a large number of firms sort of feeding off each other and making, so one company making hardware, hinges and brackets for doors. So another company started making locks and door keeps and handles and things like that. And before you knew it, it had grown into quite a massive concern, really, quite a significant size. And that was the origination of it. The original Stanley involvement in the hardware business, if you like, was at the manufactory, the original Stanley boat in 1844. That's when that etching is from. And these are pictures of the developing Stanley works from the middle of the 19th century through to around about the First World War. And you can see they were fairly large enterprises, quite massive factories. So that was kind of the birthplace of the Stanley concept. And this is Mr. Stanley, I presume, if you don't mind the pun. It's so Frederick Trent Stanley. He was the main mover behind the development of the Stanley operation, the name. He, with other members of his family, really drove this process. He was born in 1802 in New Britain, obviously, and he was one of those people who had quite a significant variety of jobs whilst he was trying to find, I think, his place in society. At one point, he'd moved down south, I think, where they thought things were perhaps economically more vibrant and more interesting. He even ended up working on the steamboats, which was an interesting sort of career move, if you like. But most of his involvement was in sort of retail, and he began to edge into the hardware business until in 1826, still a young man, he only early 20s, he decided to move back to New Britain. He'd obviously made some money whilst he was in North Carolina, and I think there was some family money involved, because when he came back, he became a bit of a serial entrepreneur, and he kind of invested in a number of businesses to try and really grow his fortune, if you like. It wasn't until 1830 when, with his brother, he really started the Stanley business. They invested in a brass foundry, which another member of the family had actually started, Stanley Woodruff, which was the kind of start of their involvement in this business. And I think they learned quite a lot through that process. And certainly Frederick was more of a strategist than a hands-on individual. And over time developed the plans. And then they moved into their own company, making bolts and associated hardware. And that was the picture of the building I showed you earlier. The interesting thing, as I say, about Frederick, although the company bears his name to this day, he wasn't really that hands-on in terms of running the business. He was very involved strategically. He did a lot of planning for where it should go, raising funds and developing things. But in terms of day-to-day running, that really wasn't his forte, if you like, wasn't his cup of tea. In fact, he was much more interested in politics, to the extent that he became almost sort of fully involved in the political scene around New England and Connecticut. He was the first warden of New Britain when it was a developing. At the time, it was a small village and grew into this town. But then it was incorporated into city status, and he became its first mayor, and was very active in that period in bringing in things like, as it says there, glass lighting, the railways, which was a fundamental part of the development of the economy for that part of the world. So bringing in a full rail service to the town was very important, and building and developing reservoir-fed water supplies for the city, all important. As a small aside, one of the things I discovered when I was researching this, I mean, I knew a fair bit about Stanley's, having worked there, but not a hell of a lot about the very early history. And I started looking through some of the material we have in the collection. And it's quite funny, when you start doing that, a few coincidences popped out. So one of the things I discovered, in fact, I was already aware of, was this small book, Foundations for the Future, the history of the Stanley Works. And it was written in 1950, early 1950. It's written in very flowery language. It talks about Yankee indomitability and things like that, which I found fascinating. But it's an interesting read, quite a difficult read because the language is quite archaic in some ways. But the coincidence about it was this book was discovered in America by an economics professor from the UK, who found it and thought, oh, that's very interesting. He brought it back to the UK and actually donated it to Stanley Tools. And Stanleys donated their archive to the Hawley collection eventually. So I'd read that and I'd been aware of the book and its derivation. What I hadn't realized was there was a letter attached. And it was a letter from the professor of economics explaining how he'd found the book and offering it to Stanleys. The coincidence is that the professor was a chap called Eric Dubigin, who was my course tutor at university, which was, so you talk about the way things become quite coincidental. So that kind of made me think there's some serendipity going on here. But and that's what I mean about so this is a quote from part of the thing, talking about Frederick being possessed of a Yankee courage, ingenuity, and diligence. And he was certainly a bit of a force of nature. He got things done and, was quite a character by all accounts. As I say, it was a bit of a family affair. So he'd started the Stanley Boat Company with his brother, William. Henry is a cousin, and Henry had started a completely different business. He was also involved in a whole series of businesses. It seems to be something that family did. They were involved in various entrepreneurial activities in the area. And he was one of the guys who kind of led the way in terms of investment in companies. He'd started, though, the Stanley Rule and Level Company as a joint stock venture by buying out another company, Hall and Knapp, that made levels and squares and other tools like that. And A. Stanley & Co., another relative, slightly more distant, who had a company making rules. And they were all brought together under the Stanley Rule and Level Company. So still on the theory of, this is a picture of one of the catalogues we have in the collection, which I didn't bring over today because it's in fairly delicate state. But it's a very early, as you can see, 1898 copy of the catalogue that they had. They actually bought, some of you would be familiar with the concept of the Bailey plane, which is one of the products that really drove Stanley's growth later. But the way they acquired that was quite interesting in that they bought the machinery and the inventory and all of the equipment that went into making it from Leonard Bailey, who had originally designed and created the plane. And they moved the entire operation to New Britain, including Leonard Bailey. So he was moved up and became sort of one of the senior managers of the operation and worked there for quite a while in terms of developing the Stanley range of planes, and very much based on his original Bailey plane design. Come 1920, the company was beginning to really go places, and they decided to consolidate, or certainly Stanley Works. The two brothers decided they wanted to consolidate things. And they bought out the cousin to create what was called Stanley Works. Well, Stanley Works bought it and created the Stanley's Tools division. And they created the first Stanley logo. The Stanley logo has been through a whole series of iterations. Originally, at one time, it was orange and yellow, orange and green, which was a really strange color. But this was the one they came up with to show that they combined the two businesses together. It didn't last very long. It was only their logo for a short while. So we're at the point where Stanley's is really beginning to look and feel like the company that we know more today, if you like. But it's true to say that the Stanley family themselves weren't really the driving force behind that. They certainly were heavily involved in terms of the decision-making, the investments. But in terms of running the process, it was probably this guy who, the heart of Stanley's, he was known as William Henry Hart. born in 1834. He joined Stanley in 1854. He was brought in, Frederick knew William Hart's father, and the Stanley brothers were looking for someone to come in and kind of pull the thing together, because I think having brought bits in from different places, it needed coordinating and sorting out and running as a proper business. So they brought William in on the promise that if he did well and sort of turned the business round and helped it to be successful, they would look after him. They would have a senior job lined up for him. Within 12 months, he was the treasurer of the company. He'd been appointed company secretary, and within 2 years, he'd moved on to be on the main board. What's remarkable about that is that he was 19 years old when he joined. So by 2 years from there, by the time he was 21, he was a main board director. And he was then very much the force behind the Stanley Works success over the next 60 plus years. He was there throughout his entire life. He worked for the company. And interestingly, as well as managing the business, he was a bit of an inventor. He was an engineer. So he developed not so much the final product, but the tools that made the tools. So he developed machines to help improve the way that, for example, the way that rules were assembled and the way that things were cut to shape and all of that. He worked on developing a lot of that, and certainly was, I think, fundamentally responsible for the success of the Stanley brand, and was well known for sort of driving around town. I was in his early automobile. It was quite a thing, but he was, as I say, the prime moving force behind the business, I think. It's interesting how war often seems to be a factor in the development or not of certain businesses. And Stanley has certainly benefited from the American Civil War. The breakout, sometimes, I must admit, when I was thinking about the history of Stanley's, it hadn't really occurred to me that they'd gone through that period. But actually, the American Civil War began about, says there, 20 years after the company had been incorporated. Frederick was very, as I say, he was very involved in politics and definitely had an eye for the main chance and saw an opportunity really to make some money out of this conflict. So he applied for a license to manufacture. Cost the grand sum of $10, but actually was a huge benefit to the company. They made all sorts of, not weapons, but tools and equipment and other things for the northern side of the battle. And it was a huge boost to the company's business. Some of them actually got involved. So certainly William served for a while. Some of the Stanley brothers served for a while. I think Frederick served in a kind of back office role, if you like. He was certainly involved, but he didn't get involved directly in any of the conflicts. But the family were very much on the side of the northern half of the battle, if you like, and not so much the Confederacy. But it really set them up for going forward once the war ended and there was a period of rebuilding. They were well placed to take advantage of that, which is a bit of a theme that sort of repeats throughout history. I thought I'd just put up a bit of a timeline of the way that the product range expanded quite. It wasn't a planned progression. It went in fits and starts, and sometimes by acquisition, sometimes by development. But you can see from its original, when they started to bring in the Stanley Rule and Level Company, then they introduced hammers, and they went through all of the things you would expect to see in a full range of hand tools, if you like. I guess the surprise for me was that utility knives were kind of the last big product line to be added to the core Stanley family, if you like. Because you think about it now, the Stanley knife is the thing that everyone, the one tool that you associate with Stanley tools is that knife. But it didn't actually join the family until quite late. It probably seems, it's a long time ago now for us, but in the whole way that the company developed, that was quite an interesting sort of fact that I certainly hadn't been aware of before. So this is very much the timeline from the American perspective. What I'm talking about now is how the tools are developed over that period of time, 80 odd years. The company had been growing quite significantly and were a serious presence, the number one tool company in the States, certainly. But they had aspirations to move abroad. So they began looking around the world. At the same time, in Sheffield, there was a whole range of other tool development activities going on throughout the 18th and 19th century, up to the modern day. And the Sheffield origin of the business, I guess, was started by this guy, or at least the premises where it ended up. James Arscott Chapman, which is not a name you see very often these days, but there you go. So he began making braces in a cottage on Woodside Lane, one cottage, very much where the current Stanley factory is. So he'd make them in one cottage, go next door and pack them up, and then sell them. And did quite well at it. It grew quite sharply to the extent that he was able to develop that site on Rutland Road into what was called the Industry Tool Works. Again, not a huge presence. I'll show you a picture in a minute. It wasn't a particularly big operation. But by the end of the century, he was making quite a wide range of tools, hammers, drills, wrenches, so forth, as well as the braces he'd started with. And these are some of the advertising you would have seen at the time. And that is James Chapman. I have a feeling it's the son of James Arscott Chapman, having looked at it again. I'm not sure that's the original, but anyway, that's the family that the son did go on to run the business, certainly. Chapmans were growing quite nicely. They had a nice presence. And a Sheffield businessman by the name of Norman Neal, no association with Neal Tools, for those of you who are familiar with James Neal. This is a different, not even part of the family, it's a completely different individual. And I think at the beginning of the 1930s, he began buying up shares, certainly in Chapman's, but also a few other Sheffield firms. And by 1936, he had a controlling share. There's some debate about why he was doing that, and I think certainly with hindsight, can't prove it. But I think quite a few people think he had a sort of eye to the main chance. He marketing their tools on a retail level. But once it became apparent, they wanted a base in the UK somewhere. And Sheffield seemed an absolutely obvious place to put it. Norman was there, front and centre, and sold his controlling share to Stanleys in Connecticut. The company was very quickly then established, and I think we have documentary evidence of both. So on the left is the original certificate of incorporation for Chapman's Limited, which was sometime after they'd started operation. This was when they were formally incorporated on the London Stock Exchange. And then in whatever date this was, 1938, this was the resolution to make them Stanley Works Great Britain Limited. And that's the first time you see the Stanley name actually operating in the UK as an actual entity, if you like, not just some products that were being shipped over, but as a genuine business. So that's the beginnings, if you like, of Stanley's presence, genuine presence in Sheffield in the late 30s. That's the Industry Tool Works with the Industry Tools sign replaced by Stanley Works GB Limited. As you can see, it wasn't a huge concern. It was quite a small operation. Say it was, a small two-story factory. A couple of cottages had been sort of crammed together and developed, and not far from here, Woodside Lane. Stanley Tools sent over an American, Hoyt C. Pease, as a director to come and run the UK operation. And by all accounts, he was quite a lively guy and did a great job in terms of sort of running the business, getting it up and off the ground. He recruited a guy called Owen Tannitt from Nottingham, who really was the kind of UK development arm of the business. And Owen certainly drove the business forward to the point, his name was still talked about when I joined Stanley in the 70s. So you can tell he'd made a big impression on some of the people who worked there. And he went on, as I say, really to be the prime mover behind the development in the UK. The company really took off. I think it was a good time to be selling tools in the UK. They were very much aimed at craftsmen in those days. They were aimed at people whose job it was to use tools. And there was a lot of development going on. So it really took off. It was going very well. But again, what happened? War. So we saw the outbreak of World War II. Production was switched, as many Sheffield firms, to various things to help the war effort. Munitions, not so much sort of bayonets and swords, which you think would be an obvious thing to do for a knife manufacturer, but other things such as fuse primers, tracer shells, and breast drills. A little fact that I stumbled across is that every tank produced in Britain during the war had a 905 Stanley breast drill in its toolkit, which was quite interesting. And it's just a very, I still have my old breast drill, and it's great. I mean, for precision work, you can't beat it. And you can actually get some power into it if you know what you're doing. Even when the war was still going on, plans were developed to really bring Woodside up to a much more significant development. And this is where another one of the coincidences sort of happened. One of the things I look after at the collection is the photographic archive. I'm a bit of a photographer, so I kind of enjoy doing that. And in the pile of photographs we had, a lot of which had been sort of well sorted, but some were yet to be organized, was a big box of, well, it was an old Smith's Crisps box, funnily enough, full of photographs. And it had come from Stanley Tools. It had been, what was in a filing cabinet had been dumped into this Smith's Crisps box and given to Ken, who'd gone through and sort of basically annotated it, but not done much more than that. So I started going through that and looking in there and discovered this little booklet, I suppose you'd call it, which is actually somebody had had the foresight to take photographs at every stage. So these are the photographs there of every stage of the development of Woodside, and just stick them in a little homemade folder, which is a fantastic record of the development of that site. So we have, it's not a huge number of photographs, but it takes it through from start to finish of what's going on. So you can see the way that even before the war was over, they were planning really to put themselves in a position to take advantage of what happened after, assuming that the outcome went the right way. So there you can see the developments and the factory emerging, this last bit, very much as you'd see it today. Owen Tannett was very much a sort of driving force behind things. He was a good manager by all accounts. People liked working for him, and the company really sort of benefited from that. Also, the original tent had been for the UK operation to supply the UK and maybe a few other empire markets, the terms that we used in some of the documents from the day. And that, I think, was very much looking at places like India and what have you. But the war kind of changed all that, because after 1945, export markets around the world were booming, and the UK was in a much better position than the US at that time to service that need, if you like. So very quickly, exports began to take off, and within less than 2 years, they were exporting to 60 countries around the world. Stanley had always prided itself, one of their brand ethos, if you like, is the toolbox of the world, and that's true. But it's interesting to think that in that immediate post-war period, it was the UK that was driving Stanley's export activity rather than the US, who were focusing. I mean, they had a huge market anyway in the US, and they were focusing on that in Canada. and South America to a lesser extent. The UK was really driving marketing around the rest of the world, which was quite, I think, a bit of an unexpected development, but it certainly helped in terms of the development. That meant, of course, with post-war reconstruction and the beginnings of the move away from craftspeople doing everything to more do-it-yourself type activities, there was a great demand for tools, and the decision was taken to expand the factory even further at Woodside. So again, and we have the pictures of this, you saw the factory begin to develop right through through the 50s to the major office development I'll talk about in a minute in 1961. As I say, it was driven by, I think, a lot of it by the emergence of DIY as a real thing, because up until that point, people really hadn't done it so much on their own. So those of you who've driven past on that side of the building will be familiar with the office building. That's the lobby that I used to walk through every day, and I always loved the map. I don't know, and to this day I don't know what happened to that map. I'd love to know when the building was vacated, because last time I was there it had gone, and I don't know where it's gone. So if anybody knows where it is, please tell me, because I'd love to know. Because it was a great thing, and that's also where the Stanley knife used to be. This is the main office block. Perhaps my office was just about there, those two windows. So I was sat not right next to the window, one over, but so that brings back good memories for me. I had a great time working for them. The building there was developed, so the ground floor was the computer suite, which had only really just been set up when I arrived. If you think about it, that was they set it up in the late 70s. And that whole of the ground floor was taken up with computer equipment, huge machines used to drive stock management, sales, reporting, but it took up the whole of the ground floor. And actually, it's probably less powerful than, in terms of processing, than the mobile phone I've got in my pocket at the moment. But amazing. It was quite a thing. Ecclesfield, also in the famous Smith's crisp box, was this folder, which is another. I don't know if it was the same person, but somebody had the same idea, and they've actually tracked through the development of the Ecclesfield plant, and actually in a lot more detail this time. There's photos of the equipment being installed and all sorts. Again, quite fascinating. But a very short-lived factory. If you drive through Ecclesfield now, although it wasn't really open, well, 1960, it was probably up and running properly. It's been gone for quite a few years now. So it came and went very quickly as a factory, which is quite amazing when you look at some of the building that had to go in, because as there was some very heavy equipment there, some big forges, some big hammer presses, the footings were incredibly deep. They were incredibly, it was a very solid building, the way it was built. And they had to do a lot with drainage, because apparently it was in an area that didn't exactly flood, but was quite wet. So it was a huge investment. Now it's a housing estate. The UK, as it developed, as I say, after the war, things began to really take off in more of a DIY boom sense. And you saw what we used to call the big sheds, Wicks, DIY, B&Q, Homebase, those kind of guys, and their predecessors begin to take off. B&Q actually didn't launch under that name until 1969, but it left Stanley with the interesting position of having to market to a kind of different breed. Prior to that, we'd gone through wholesale channels to hardware retailers. This was a whole different approach to things. And we had to get much more kind of marketing-led from the get-go, really. We got our own sales force for quite a while, from the 50s, but that was very much about selling to the industry, not selling to the end user. And then we had to go into introducing market research and advertising, and luckily creating a marketing department, which is how I got a job there. So merchandising was always a key thing. Interesting to note that Stanleys are back advertising on football perimeters. It's quite a recent match. Actually, it's a European match, but you see Stanley on the hoardings again, which kind of brings things full circle quite nicely. But this was the kind of thing that really started to appear in leaflet form, in magazines, and all sorts of things. Christmas presents that men dream about. So ladies, if you're thinking about, it's not far off Christmas. It's now's your chance. But it was very much about trying to get the message to the end user. So rather than trying to push product through wholesale markets to the hardware trade, which had been the previous approach, to try and get the end user interested in buying Stanley products and then pull the product through. And that was quite an interesting switch in strategy, because I think even when I started working at Stanley's, there was still a bit of a tension between the people who were interested in the craft side of the product and the people who were interested in mass market. And that was a tension that sometimes was quite difficult to manage. I was very much on the side of, craft products are great, but if you're going to sell one, large shoulder plane every month, you're not going to make a lot of money out of that. If you can sell 100,000 screwdrivers or Stanley knives, that's a whole different proposition. But the one thing that Stanley really maintained throughout it all, and to this day I'm proud of it, was that the quality of the product was always good. For whatever price point we marketed, that was probably the best quality at that level you'd find in the market. And that, to this day, I think was something that Stanley's really got right. There were so many cheap copies of Stanley tools and others, Footprint and Record, had the same problems of being copied by others. But the quality was shocking and sometimes dangerous. Whereas even though we were moving the value down in terms of making products cheaper, we didn't let the quality slide. And I think that was a key point in its success, really. We redesigned all the packaging, the sort of current, well, not the current, the last but one logo and the whole branding of yellow and black came into place. And really the UK drove a lot of that as well. Alan Cook, who was our advertising manager at the time, was a prime mover in trying to consolidate everything into one coherent package, what was known as the code book. That was our advertising Bible, if you like, the thing that we used for every time we were designing product, packaging, whatever, to make sure we had a consistent message to the market. We'd entered the garden tool market in 1973. Again, that was a short-lived experience, because we sold it again in the early 80s, because I was involved in that, because it didn't quite fit with our hand tool operation. So we were kind of in and out of that one fairly quickly. But we did open a very successful facility out at Hawley, which is the one bit of the operation, but there's still a little bit of activity just on the outskirts of Rotherham. A little detour to talk about the Millennium ear knife. As many of you will know, made in 1821 by Joseph Rogers and Sons. We were very fortunate in 69, Stanleys acquired the knife at auction. It had come up for auction, and there was certainly a lot of interest from overseas, particularly from America. I think that the knife would disappear. And Stanley stepped in and bought it, and it was on display at Woodside for a long time. And the Stanley knife is how I first, another little aside, one of those instances, that's how I first met Ken Hawley. I'd been at Stanley's for about 5 weeks, and there was an exhibition at the Cutlers Hall, and my boss at the time said, "Oh, just come down and have a look around. It's an interesting building. I'd never been inside." So I went down, and there was a couple of sales guys and a few of the marketing team and myself, and we had a stand with some pictures of the knife and some other stuff. And there were lots of other tool firms from Sheffield there. And I'd had a look around, and I was stood at the stand at one point, and I noticed that everybody else had disappeared. And this guy came over to start talking to me. It was Ken. And he spent the next 20 minutes berating me on the fact that we hadn't been cleaning the ear knife properly. So that was my first introduction to Ken, but it was great. The one thing about Ken was he was always very happy to share his expertise and knowledge with everyone, whether you wanted it or not. But it was great. And we then we kind of bumped into each other a lot over the years. So, and I'd always followed the collection, so it was good. But to end up back here was quite, I'll say, one of those coincidences. The knife became part of the collection in 2010, on loan at the time. But I'm very pleased to say, and some of you may be aware, that actually Stanley, or Stanley Black & Decker as they are now, have donated the knife to us in perpetuity. And Sir George Buckley, a Sheffield lad, who was the former chairman of Stanley Black & Decker, came over to do the presentation and give us the knife. And we were very pleased about that and set it up as part of the Sheffield Treasures exhibition. Some of the exhibition material was stolen. They did not get away with the ear knife, which is, I think we're eternally grateful for. I will let you into a little secret. It's now known as the Millennium ear knife. And if you read about it in the press, it always says it's called that because it's got 2,000 blades on it. It's not. It's not got 2,000 blades, because after its acquisition at auction, the update was not every year. So it's got slightly less than 2,000, but as long as you don't tell anyone, that's fine. It's still the Millennium ear knife. Also in the famous Smith's Crisps box were lots and lots of pictures of Stanley exhibitions. And as I've done a lot of those, they were great interest to me. As I got deeper down, though, it became interesting in that I began to see people that I knew. So the three guys there, one of them on the left is Alan Cook, who was our advertising manager, who I mentioned earlier. He was really a prime mover in the whole worldwide development of Stanley's advertising operation. Keith Oldfield, and then John Bowie is the other guy, who, another coincidence, was my next door neighbour when I moved to Sheffield as well. I've put the one of the elephant in because I was involved in a subsequent one of those where we did a live carving of an advertising hoarding just off Oxford Street. Unfortunately, I can't find any photographs of it. So this was the closest thing I got to. Some other people I recognise, Mike Stanton, who did all the football advertising. That's this guy. And Helen Morgan, who worked with me over there. So some familiar sights in the box, in the famous box. I started finding pictures like this. So when I moved to the marketing team, I did a lot on merchandising. And this was the team of merchandising ladies that I worked with for a while. So it was nice to see them. This was the very last campaign I did for Stanley Tools. I became an engineer of cardboard. One of the things we had to do was design things for retail outlets to promote the tools. So it was quite amazing. Usually working with a company in Sheffield called Green Ups, some of you may remember, and developing these things that it was great watching the retailers trying to put them together if we weren't there. But anyway, it was good fun. And then I found this, which was me in 1980, showing that Mr. Southgate is not the only Gareth that rocks a waistcoat. So I have no memory of this photograph being taken and what it was used for. I don't remember it ever being used, but I had actually had my hair cut especially for that, which is more recent history. In the 1980s, we acquired Raybone Chesterman. They had been taken over by a finance company, if you like. We took them back into our ownership. We began to move back into sort of industrial tools again through proto-industrial tools, making sockets and spanners, toolboxes, and we went back into the decorator market with Mosley Stone. It was getting to be a huge portfolio now. There were, if you look at the catalogues from the time, there were like 2,000, more than 2,000 separate products in the portfolio, which is quite huge. Sales were going gangbusters, to be honest. Sales were doing really well, but because of the competition, particularly from cheap foreign imports, profitability was not so great. So we were having to constantly be looking at the competitive position in the market. And the profitability really began to suffer as we got into the 90s. So we had to start taking some fairly big cost-cutting savings. We closed the Rayburn Chesterman operation in Birmingham. The same thing was happening in the States from like the 1906 onwards. Stanley Works was struggling a little bit in their own domestic operation. They lost 800 jobs in a fairly major downscaling operation. 1998, Stanley itself announced that we were closing the Ecclesfield site, bearing in mind we'd only opened it in the 50s. And we were actually winding down production of the mature products at Woodside, moving the remaining manufacturing to Hawley, which is, as I said, there's a little bit still going on there, but not much. New century. Was it the dawn of a new era or the end of the road? Woodside closed. I mean, by that time, I'd actually moved on to another company. But it was still some sadness that I discovered that, you know, Woodside was going to close. It was going to be a bit dated in terms of its, you know, setup, but it was still a great presence. And most of the work was moved out to Hawley. The plan at the time, and they thought they had someone lined up, was that people were going to buy various bits of the Woodside element. The office block was quite presentable. The factory could have really been turned around. The plan was to find a buyer, but they didn't, and it still hasn't been. Some parts of the site are being used for very different purposes now. So I won't go into all of that. Last time I went to the place, which wasn't that long ago, they're running these airsoft zombie experiences now, where you're locked in an old factory or an old office block, and they have various actors and that who jump out of nooks and crannies and try and frighten the life out of you. And well, it's a very interesting development for me from where it started. So. 2006, really, that was the end of the kind of pure Sheffield presence. What little was left went to Rotherham. The workforce all over has been cut quite a lot. And we stopped making screwdrivers, planes and chisels altogether in the UK. So really it was quite a sad end. Well, it looked at one point like it was going to be a sad ending to the story. But I think there's a chance that things will turn around. Maybe not for Sheffield, but Stanley Works then acquired Black & Decker in 2010 and have formed what is a fairly huge operation. They're back now to having thousands of product lines, and they're very heavily present in both the hand tool and the power tool market, as well as all sorts of other industrial products and services. So I'm hoping that certainly they are very present now in the UK again. At one point, Stanleys had kind of disappeared, but if you go to any DIY shop, any of the big sort of B&Qs of this world, you'll start to see Stanley Black & Decker coming back with their new logo. But really, I think beginning to build up to be quite a strong operation. And that is the end of the talk, I think.